By mid-1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered, and the war in Europe was over. Yet in the Pacific, Japan refused to lay down arms. Despite devastating losses at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the destruction of its navy, Japan's military leaders vowed to continue fighting, even if it meant sacrificing millions. For American leaders, the prospect of a full-scale invasion of mainland Japan, known as Operation Downfall, was daunting. Military planners estimated that an invasion could cost up to 1 million Allied casualties and even more Japanese lives. Faced with this grim forecast, President Harry S. Truman made one of the most consequential decisions in human history. During the war, the United States had secretly developed a powerful new weapon under the Manhattan Project, an atomic bomb. Scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer and Enrico Fermi, had worked in top-secret labs to harness nuclear energy for military use. By July 1945, the first successful atomic test, codenamed Trinity, was conducted in the New Mexico desert. The explosion was more powerful than anything the world had ever seen. The weapon was ready. The question was, should it be used? On August 6, 1945, the U.S. dropped the first atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. The blast leveled the city and instantly killed an estimated 80,000 people. Tens of thousands more died from burns, injuries, and radiation exposure in the days that followed. Still, Japan did not surrender. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an additional 40,000 people. On August 15, 1945, Japan finally announced its surrender. The formal ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd, marking the official end of World War II. The atomic bombings remain among the most controversial actions in military history. Supporters argue they were necessary to end the war quickly and save lives. Critics claim they targeted civilians and introduced a terrifying new era of warfare. Regardless of the moral debate, the effect was undeniable. The war was over, and America had demonstrated a level of military power that no other nation could match. The end of World War II marked a new beginning for the United States. It emerged not only as a victor, but as a global superpower. With its cities untouched, economy booming, and military unmatched, America was now at the center of a reshaped world order. In the next chapter, we'll explore how the U.S. transitioned from wartime to peacetime, lead global reconstruction, and confronted its next great challenge, the Cold War. With the surrender of Japan in 1945, World War II came to a dramatic end. But for the United States, the war's conclusion was not a return to normalcy. It was the beginning of a new global role. For the first time in history, America stood alone as the world's dominant political, economic, and military power. While much of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, the United States had emerged from the conflict stronger than ever. Its industries were booming, its military unmatched, and its influence far. The post-war period marked the dawn of what would be called the American century. At home, the United States underwent a rapid economic transformation. Millions of returning soldiers benefited from the GI Bill, which provided education, housing, and job opportunities. Suburbs expanded, consumer goods flooded the market, and the country entered an era of unprecedented prosperity. The war had ended, the Great Depression, and now the U.S. economy was leading the way in global recovery. Abroad, the U.S. took center stage in rebuilding the world. Through the Marshall Plan, America provided over $13 billion, nearly $150 billion, today to help rebuild Western Europe. This wasn't just humanitarian, it was strategic. A stable Europe meant less chance of communist revolutions and more reliable trading partners. Meanwhile, institutions like the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were established with strong American leadership, ensuring the U.S. would have a major voice in global governance. But with victory came new tensions. The alliance between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, forged out of necessity during the war, quickly dissolved. Their opposing ideologies, capitalism and democracy versus communism and authoritarianism, began to clash. The world entered a new conflict, the Cold War. Unlike the global battles of World War II, this was a war of influence, arms races, espionage, and proxy wars. The atomic bomb had ended one war, but its existence now fueled a terrifying standoff. Still, the legacy of World War II was clear. The United States had proven that it could project power across the globe, mobilize its economy for massive production, and lead coalitions in the face of tyranny. It was no longer a reluctant participant on the world stage. It was now the architect of the New World Order. As the 20th century continued, America would face new challenges from Korea to Vietnam, from civil rights movements to space exploration. But the foundations of its global influence were laid during the years of World War II in transforming itself to defeat the Axis powers. The United States also transformed the world forever. The U.S. joined the Allied powers, which included Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and numerous resistance movements across occupied Europe. The Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, had made substantial territorial gains by 1942. The United States now had to confront Germany's military juggernaut in Europe and the relentless expansion of Japan across the Pacific. President Franklin D. Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill quickly agreed on a Europe-first strategy: defeat Hitler first, then turn full attention to Japan. But this didn't mean the Pacific was ignored. America would pursue a dual strategy, striking hard across both theaters. In the European theater, the initial challenge was that the United States had no large army on the ground in Europe. The British had already withstood years of war, and the Soviet Union was locked in a brutal struggle against Nazi forces on the Eastern Front, so the U.S. focused first on North Africa, hoping to gain experience, establish supply lines, and eventually open a path to Europe. In November 1942, American and British forces launched Operation Torch, landing in Algeria and Morocco. Facing the German Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel, American forces suffered early setbacks but gradually gained strength and confidence. By May 1943, the Axis powers were defeated in North Africa. This victory paved the way for the invasion of Italy, the so-called soft underbelly of Europe. In July 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, landing in Sicily. The campaign was grueling, marked by fierce German resistance and challenging terrain. Although Mussolini was overthrown, the German army dug in across Italy, and the campaign dragged on far longer than expected. Meanwhile, U.S. and British planners prepared for the ultimate objective: a massive invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe. That moment came on June 6, 1944, D-Day, when Allied forces launched Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 156,000 troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France. The American landings at Omaha and Utah Beach were met with fierce resistance, particularly at Omaha, where casualties were heavy, but by the end of the day, a critical beachhead was established. Over the following weeks, Allied forces broke through German lines, liberated Paris, and began pushing toward Germany from the west. At the same time, the Soviet Red Army was advancing from the east, squeezing Hitler's forces between two unstoppable fronts. In December 1944, Hitler launched a surprise counterattack through the Ardennes forest, known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last major offensive in the west. American forces, caught off guard and surrounded in some areas, endured brutal winter conditions. The defense of Bastogne, led by General Anthony McAuliffe and the 101st Airborne Division, became legendary. Despite initial losses, the Allies regrouped and repelled the offensive by January 1945. From that point on, the march toward Berlin accelerated. While the war raged in Europe, the Pacific theater presented an entirely different kind of warfare. The vast distances, scattered islands, and fierce Japanese resistance made for a brutal, unforgiving campaign. After the devastation at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese launched a series of rapid conquests, capturing the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and advancing deep into Southeast Asia. In early 1942, American and Filipino forces surrendered at Bataan, and the infamous Bataan Death March, a 65-mile forced march of POS, horrified the world. But by mid-1942, momentum began to shift. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Using intercepted Japanese communications, U.S. naval forces under Admiral Chester Nimitz ambushed the Japanese fleet and sank 4 aircraft carriers. The loss of these carriers, along with hundreds of planes and experienced pilots, crippled Japan's naval strength and changed the course of the Pacific War. After Midway, the U.S. adopted a strategy known as island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions and capturing strategically located islands to get closer to the Japanese mainland. One of the first and most significant land campaigns was the Battle of Guadalcanal, 1942-1943, where American Marines endured months of brutal jungle warfare to secure a vital airstrip. As the campaign progressed, each island battle grew more intense and costly. At Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, U.S. forces encountered fierce resistance, including suicide charges and underground bunkers. The Japanese were determined to fight to the death. The brutality of this warfare shocked American soldiers and reinforced the belief that defeating Japan would require immense sacrifice. One of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific was the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. After weeks of bombing, nearly 70,000 U.S. Marines stormed the volcanic island defended by 21,000 entrenched Japanese soldiers. The fight lasted over a month and resulted in more than 26,000 American casualties. The iconic image of Marines raising the American flag atop Mount Suribachi became a powerful symbol of perseverance and sacrifice. Soon after came the invasion of Okinawa, the last major battle before reaching Japan itself. It was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific and one of the deadliest. Japanese forces, including civilians, mounted desperate defenses, including kamikaze suicide attacks on American ships. Over 12,000 Americans were killed, and estimates of Japanese deaths, including civilians, exceeded 100,000. The battle demonstrated that a potential invasion of mainland Japan would result in catastrophic losses on both sides. By mid-1945, both Germany and Japan were on the brink of defeat. In Europe, Allied forces had liberated concentration camps, revealing the full horror of the Holocaust. Hitler committed suicide in April 1945, and Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, VA Day, Victory in Europe Day. Yet the war in the Pacific raged on. The United States now faced the grim possibility of a full-scale invasion of Japan, a campaign projected to cost millions of lives. As we will see in Chapter 3, America would make a decision that would not only end the war but usher in a new and terrifying era of warfare, the atomic age. At the start of the 20th century, the United States had no intention of becoming a dominant global power. Its painful experience in World War I had left deep psychological and political scars. Although the U.S. had emerged on the victorious side, the costs of that war both in lives and resources had fostered a deep aversion to foreign entanglements. The Senate's refusal to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and the rejection of the League of Nations marked a turning point. America turned inward. Through the 1920s and 1930s, domestic concerns took precedence, especially as the Great Depression gripped the country. The nation's leaders and citizens were more focused on economic survival than on rising tensions abroad. But while America looked inward, the rest of the world was sliding into chaos. In Europe, political extremism was gaining traction. Adolf Hitler, a former soldier turned political agitator, rose to power in Germany by exploiting nationalist fervor, resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, and widespread economic despair. His Nazi party promoted a dangerous ideology based on racial superiority, militarism, and expansionism. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist regime by the 1920s. And in Asia, Japan had begun an aggressive campaign of territorial expansion, starting with the invasion of Manchuria in 1931 and escalating with the full-scale invasion of China in 1937. These powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, would later form the Axis alliance, united by their authoritarian ideologies and imperial ambitions. Yet in the United States, many remained indifferent or deliberately distant. The trauma of World War I still loomed large in the national psyche. In response to growing concerns that America might be drawn into another foreign conflict, Congress passed a series of neutrality acts during the 1930s. These laws aimed to prevent the United States from providing arms, loans, or support to nations at war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, though increasingly aware of the dangers posed by the Axis powers, had to tread carefully. Public opinion was strongly against involvement in another European war. The turning point began in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war on Germany. The Nazi war machine quickly steamrolled across Europe. By 1940, France had fallen, and Britain stood alone against the might of the Third Reich. The Luftwaffe launched a relentless bombing campaign against British cities in what became known as the Battle of Britain. Roosevelt, re-elected for an unprecedented third term, recognized that if Britain were to fall, the United States would likely face the Axis powers alone. Though still officially neutral, America began to prepare. Roosevelt's administration introduced the first peacetime draft in American history and increased military spending. Meanwhile, he crafted policies to assist Britain without violating neutrality laws. The cash-and-carry policy allowed warring nations to purchase arms from the U.S. as long as they paid in cash and transported the goods themselves. This approach evolved into the more ambitious Lend-Lease Act, passed in 1941. Under this legislation, the United States could provide military aid to any country whose defense was deemed vital to American security. Britain became the primary recipient, but after Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, the U.S. extended aid to Joseph Stalin's communist regime as well. This pragmatic alliance underscored the severity of the threat posed by Nazi Germany. As Roosevelt declared, the United States would become the arsenal of democracy. American factories began to churn out tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons at an astonishing rate. The economy, still recovering from the Depression, experienced a revitalization. Jobs were created, industries expanded, and a new sense of national purpose began to emerge. Yet despite this transformation, the U.S. was still not officially at war. That would change dramatically and suddenly on a quiet Sunday morning in December. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, over 2,400 Americans were killed, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. The attack stunned the nation. The very next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress swiftly declared war on Japan. Within days, Germany and Italy, allies of Japan, declared war on the United States. What had started as a European and Asian conflict was now a full-blown world war, and America was in it. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a defining moment. Overnight, public opinion shifted from isolation to full support for war. The entire nation mobilized. Millions of men enlisted or were drafted into the military. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers to fill roles left vacant by soldiers and to support the war effort. The government launched massive propaganda campaigns urging citizens to buy war bonds, conserve resources, and remain vigilant. The image of Rosie the Riveter became a national symbol of female empowerment and industrial strength. Factories across the country were retooled for wartime production. Automakers built tanks and bombers instead of cars. Shipyards worked around the clock to produce vessels for the Navy and merchant fleet. The scale of American industrial mobilization was unmatched. In 1941 alone, U.S. manufacturers produced over 3 million guns, 24,000 tanks, and 54,000 aircraft. This production would only increase as the war progressed, turning the United States into the world's most formidable manufacturing power. But America's transformation was not just economic. The war also reshaped American identity and ideals. Isolationism, once the dominant political philosophy, gave way to a belief in internationalism. The Axis threat had made it clear that oceans could no longer protect the homeland. For the first time, Americans began to accept that the United States had a role to play in global security and stability. This ideological shift was reinforced by the nature of the conflict itself. As reports of Nazi atrocities began to surface, the war took on a moral dimension. The fight was no longer just about territorial boundaries or national interests. It was a struggle between tyranny and democracy, between barbarism and civilization. American soldiers weren't just fighting for their country, they were fighting for a vision of the world rooted in liberty and justice. By the end of 1941, the United States had undergone a profound transformation. What had begun as a reluctant journey toward involvement had become a full commitment to global warfare. The nation was no longer an isolated power. It was now a key player in a global coalition fighting for the future of the world. This chapter marked the beginning of America's rise to global prominence. Its vast resources, industrial might, and military capabilities would soon make it the centerpiece of the Allied war effort. But the real test was still ahead. In the battles to come in North Africa, Europe, the Pacific, and beyond, the United States would have to prove itself not only as a military power but as a global leader. In Chapter 2, we will explore how America launched a two-front campaign in Europe and the Pacific, and how these strategic choices positioned the nation at the center of the post-war world order.